A deaf veteran, a war dog once deemed unfit, and a moment at the airport that changed everything. What began as a routine flight turned into a race against time where loyalty smelled what machines couldn't. He collapsed, the dog alerted, and what they uncovered could have taken lives. This is a story of redemption instinct and the first sound he heard again after years of silence. If that already moved you, like and subscribe now because the full story is just getting started. The morning light poured through the giant glass panes of Denver International Airport, casting a sterile gleam on the endless tide of travelers wheeling suitcases and juggling coffee cups. It was just another Thursday, or at least that's what Jack Simmons told himself. He sat alone at Gate 34B sipping lukewarm black coffee from a vending machine and resting his left hand on the broad-muscled head of Gunner, his K9 partner turned permanent companion. Gunner sat still, but tense the fur along his back prickled just slightly. To a stranger, the dog was just well-trained. To Jack, that twitch meant something. But he brushed it off like he had learned to brush off many things. Dizziness had come in waves that morning, but Jack chalked it up to jet lag and skipped breakfast. He'd been tired ever since they landed back from the East Coast 3 days ago, the long drive back to Colorado rattling his prosthetic hip and dulling the sharp edge of awareness he once prided himself on. 2 years had passed since the IED blast in Kandahar. The explosion had robbed him of full hearing and his left ear left fragments in his lower back the doctors never fully removed and gave him a permanent limp that no therapy really fixed. But Jack didn't like doctors. He tolerated them in war and distrusted them in peace. So when the headaches started, when the fog drifted over his mornings like a film of sleep he couldn't scrub off, he told himself it was age, not illness. That day, he and Gunner were supposed to fly to Sacramento to visit an old buddy from the 203rd Infantry. It was one of the few names left in Jack's phone that didn't redirect to a voicemail or an obituary. Gunner stirred again. This time, not just a twitch. The dog stood up, sniffed Jack's backpack, then pawed at it with one heavy, deliberate swipe. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Hey," he said, lowly tapping his thigh twice. Gunner stopped, but his tail was rigid, his ears swiveled nose now moving toward Jack's side, specifically the left side of his lower back. "What's the matter?" Jack muttered. He leaned down, feeling a dull pressure in the exact spot Gunner had focused on. No sharp pain, just a tightness. Maybe a bruise from lifting the bag wrong. Maybe nothing. Gunner, however, disagreed. At security, the tension mounted. Jack removed his belt boots, placed his laptop in the tray like every other traveler, while Gunner stayed by his side wearing the special vest that granted him TSA clearance. But as they passed through the scanner, Gunner halted. He let out a low, insistent whine and refused to move forward. The TSA agent raised an eyebrow. "Sir, is your dog trained for medical response?" Jack frowned. He's retired K9, mostly detection. PTSD support now. Because he's acting like he's alerting on something, the agent replied. "Maybe your bag?" Jack glanced at his backpack, then at Gunner. The shepherd was now pawing not at the bag, but at Jack's lower side. Not aggressively, repetitively, focused. A crowd was forming. Jack felt heat rise to his face, not embarrassment, but a more primal dread. Gunner had only done this twice in the field, once when detecting blood loss beneath a flak jacket, the other during a seizure Jack didn't know he was having. "I'm fine," Jack muttered. "He's just keyed up. Travel stress." But his voice lacked conviction. The TSA officer stepped aside to let a supervisor through. Jack waved them off. "We're good, really." Gunner whined again, tail now, low between his legs. He stepped in front of Jack, a move Jack recognized. Blocking. Protective stance. The dizziness returned. This time, stronger. Jack's vision blurred slightly at the edges. He reached for the conveyor rail to steady himself. "Sir, do you need medical assistance?" someone asked. Jack forced a laugh, but it came out slurred. "Just a long night." The TSA supervisor was already radioing for airport medical. Jack tried to wave him off, but Gunner barked once, sharp and loud. Not a warning, not aggression. Alert, medical alert. Jack knew that bark too well. A man in Navy scrubs came rushing over from the nearby med point. He crouched quickly beside Jack, who was now gripping the edge of the tray station. "What's going on?" the medic asked. "Just lightheaded," Jack muttered. "You with someone, just him." Jack nodded toward Gunner. The medic's gaze followed and narrowed. "That dog looks like he knows something you don't." Jack hated hospitals, hated being touched by strangers with latex gloves and clinical eyes. But now, sitting in the small sterile triage room next to gate B16, the dread in his stomach was no longer easy to ignore. Gunner sat squarely at his feet, still staring at Jack's lower back. The medic took vitals, checked blood pressure. "You're running a low-grade fever," he said. "You sure you didn't hit your back recently?" Jack shook his head. "Not that I can remember." "Mind if I take a look?" Jack hesitated, then nodded. The moment the medic pulled up his shirt, he froze. "You see this?" he asked, pointing at a faint swelling above the scar line. Jack craned his neck. It was reddish, a small circle, warm to the touch. "Could be a localized infection," the medic murmured. "Have you had any recent surgeries?" "Nope. Old injuries plenty." The medic didn't say much after that. He stepped out with his tablet and returned with the supervisor. Within 15 minutes, Jack was informed that he wouldn't be boarding any plane that day. "We're calling an ambulance," they told him. "You've got signs of systemic infection. If this is a deep tissue issue from an old wound, we need to act now." Jack looked down at Gunner, who finally relaxed. His tail wagged once, lightly tapping Jack's boot, as if to say, "Now you're listening." Jack leaned heavily against the armrest of the terminal's triage cot, watching as Gunner paced in tight, anxious loops. The dog was no longer alerting, but neither was he calm. Every few seconds he would circle back to Jack, nose nudging his hip eyes, searching his handler's face as if to say, "This isn't over." A nurse named Chelsea, a woman probably younger than the boots Jack wore, had just finished a series of vitals and entered notes into her tablet. "I need to get clearance from the airport physician before we can discharge you," she said, her tone clipped professional yet carrying a tinge of hesitation. Jack nodded, hiding his annoyance. He had places to be. A flight to catch, a person he hadn't seen in a decade waiting with a six-pack and lawn chairs in a Sacramento backyard. He checked his watch instinctively, only to remember the glass had cracked weeks ago. He sighed. The quiet hum of medical equipment, the distant roll of luggage wheels beyond the triage curtain, and the smell of antiseptic pulled him back to another tent halfway across the world. It wasn't the pain that worried Jack, it was the familiarity. Just as he adjusted his posture, the curtain swished open and 2 TSA agents entered, not the low-level blue shirts who scanned IDs, but senior personnel. One wore a navy suit with an earpiece, the other held a clipboard. The man in the suit spoke first. "Mr. Simmons, we've had a report about erratic K-9 behavior at a secure checkpoint." He began, his voice formal, but tinged with curiosity. Jack raised an eyebrow. "You mean Gunner?" "He wasn't erratic. He was alerting. There's a difference." The agent didn't smile. "Exactly why we're here. Unusual alerts inside a federal checkpoint, especially from a dog with military credentials, require secondary screening for both the animal and the handler." Jack narrowed his eyes. "You want to screen the dog, and you," the clipboard guy added. "It's protocol." Jack exhaled slowly, grinding his molars together. "I'm a decorated veteran with medical documentation, cleared travel status, and a certified companion animal. You want to pat me down because my dog did his job." "It's not personal, Mr. Simmons," the suit replied. "We're just doing ours." The walk to the secondary screening room felt longer than it was. Jack's back ached with every step, the muscles near his hips stiff and uncooperative. Gunner remained glued to his side, every move alert but controlled. The room they entered was small, windowless, and sterile. A standard metal detector stood near the door, and 2 female officers, one Hispanic, one African American, stood behind a table lined with gloves and test strips. "Remove your shirt and lift your undershirt to the midsection," one of them said. Jack did as instructed, ignoring the prickle of cold air against his back. He'd been through worse inspections. "Anything sharp metallic or medically implanted we should know about?" she asked. Jack pointed to his left hip. "Old shrapnel, non-magnetic, medically recorded." Noted, the other officer said, jotting it down. Can you show us exactly where Jack reached for the hem of his t-shirt, pulling it up and revealing the puckered scar where the metal had once pushed dangerously close to his kidney? As he exposed the area, the Hispanic officer leaned in, flashlight in hand. Sir, you're aware of this discoloration, right? Jack looked down. The skin surrounding the scar was an angry red, swollen in a tight circular pattern. It hadn't looked like that the night before. That's new, he admitted, suddenly less defensive. How long has it been hurting? It hasn't. Jack replied, voice quieter now. I barely noticed it. Your dog did, the other officer said flatly. She stepped back, pulling her gloves off with a snap. You need to see a physician. This isn't cosmetic. Outside the screening room, the TSA supervisor reviewed the notes with a paramedic who had joined the group. Jack overheard phrases like possible abscess, localized infection, and delayed response. What he didn't hear were the words "you can fly." A young male agent returned from the corner and handed Jack a printout. Sir, your boarding pass has been suspended. We're not medically clearing you for travel today. Jack stared at the paper. I just need a couple days antibiotics, that's all. Sir, the man said more gently, now you have a visible infection in a high-risk area near old trauma. Your dog likely caught the change before it spread too deep. But if it has flying, could trigger something worse. Altitude messes with tissue pressure. It's not just risk to you, it's liability to us. Jack clenched the paper, resisting the urge to crumple it. You going to reimburse me for a non-refundable ticket? We can file a report, came the neutral reply. But the CDC and Department of Transportation both say you're grounded until cleared by a physician. Jack stepped outside the room and lowered himself slowly onto a bench, grimacing as his hip throbbed with pressure. Gunner sat beside him, ears high, watching the crowd. You smug bastard, Jack muttered, scratching behind the dog's ear. You're smarter than I am. You know that Gunner licked his fingers once, then laid his head on Jack's knee. People passed by, giving them curious glances, some even smiling at the image of a soldier and his dog, not realizing that something far more serious had just been intercepted in that sterile room. Jack didn't care about the flight anymore. He was thinking about the pressure in his side, the waves of heat that came and went, the light chill rising from his neck. All symptoms he might have missed. All signs a silent dog had caught first. Back inside the medical checkpoint, a nurse conferred quietly with the airport physician who had just arrived. The word hospital surfaced, and Jack felt the first pangs of dread settle deep in his gut, not because of fear, but because he knew this was only the beginning of something. The question was what, and why now, and what Gunner had sensed before he did. A man in scrubs approached again, eyes serious but calm. Mr. Simmons, he said, voice low, we need to run labs. If that infection's systemic, you won't feel it until it's too late. Jack nodded, jaw tight. He looked down at Gunner, who had gone still again. The dog didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just watched like a soldier who'd already seen what was coming. The fluorescent lighting above Jack's head buzzed faintly, blending with the low murmur of voices and the distant airport PA announcing another delayed flight to Miami. Jack sat still, his body heavy, his breath-shallow eyes locked on a spot on the floor that refused to stay in focus. Gunner's chin still rested against his knee, but the dog had gone quiet, too quiet. Jack's fingers gripped the bench beneath him, not from pain, but to keep himself grounded as a strange pressure built beneath his ribs, a slow bloom of heat that radiated down his side. He had felt this once before during a long recon in southern Kandahar, when a piece of metal had lodged itself into his thigh and stayed there for 3 days before evacuation. But this felt worse. This felt systemic. He blinked twice to clear the blur creeping across his vision, but his ears had started ringing a high whine that might have been real or phantom. Gunner's head lifted suddenly, his body tensing, eyes darting toward the incoming medic team that had returned with a stretcher and saline kit. Mr. Simmons, we're going to need you to lie down so we can monitor your vitals more closely, said one of the younger medics, a sandy-haired guy with kind eyes and the calm cadence of someone used to nervous flyers. Jack shook his head gently. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. But the words were sluggish, disconnected from the force he meant to give them. "This is nothing, just dehydration." The medic didn't argue, but instead motioned toward his partner, who gently reached for Jack's elbow. "You're pale," the partner said, "and your fever's climbing. Your dog may have saved your life already. Let's not waste the warning." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but the words never came. Instead, his head tilted forward, his shoulders slumped, and his entire body went slack in one sudden, terrifying collapse. The last thing Jack heard before the darkness took over was Gunner barking loud, sharp, not aggressive, but panicked the bark of an animal that knew something was wrong and had no other way to communicate it. And then came the blur, the soft rush of nothingness, like sinking under water. Jack's body hit the floor beside the bench, his limbs twitching once, before falling still, a pool of fevered heat forming around his side just beneath the scarred tissue. Gunner lunged toward him, blocked only by the quick reflexes of a security guard who caught the leash a second too late. "Get him on the stretcher," the lead medic shouted, and within seconds Jack's limp frame was lifted, strapped down, and wheeled quickly out of the waiting area toward the emergency wing of the airport's medical center. Inside the sterile white room, chaos moved with clinical precision. IV fluids were started, oxygen mask adjusted, heart monitor attached. The attending physician doctor, Rachel Monroe, arrived in less than 3 minutes, still zipping up her coat as she scanned Jack's chart. "Veteran?" she asked, eyes darting between the vitals and the inflamed skin visible through his torn-up t-shirt. "Yes, ma'am," one of the nurses replied. "IED survivor. Reports say he's lost partial hearing and has embedded shrapnel. The dog is his retired K9 former military, too. Any recent medical procedures, none on file. The dog alerted earlier today. Security flagged him due to canine behavior. Good dog Dr. Monroe muttered more to herself than anyone else." She leaned in her gloved fingers, pressing gently around the red swollen area on Jack's hip. His body twitched in unconscious response. "It's hot. The tissue's firm. There's fluid buildup here. Get me a CBC lactate and blood cultures. Now." The lab results came back too fast. Elevated white count, spiking C-reactive protein, lactate creeping higher. The diagnosis, though tentative, was clear probable sepsis. "If this is spreading," Dr. Monroe said, her voice low but firm, "he needs antibiotics and possible debridement before this hits his bloodstream hard. Call University Medical Center. Tell them we're transferring a septic patient with combat trauma history and potential foreign body retention. Level 2 priority. Should we wait to confirm with imaging?" the nurse asked. Dr. Monroe didn't flinch. "No. His dog already confirmed it, and from what I see, he's crashing fast." Back in the corner of the medical bay, Gunner lay curled against the glass door, his eyes never leaving Jack. They had let him in surprisingly after the medic team vouched for him. He hadn't moved since Jack passed out, just remained in that same rigid pose, his breathing short ears twitching every time a machine beeped or a nurse raised her voice. A janitor passing through remarked to a tech, "That dog's acting like he understands every word." The tech, without looking up, replied, "He probably does." They administered the first dose of antibiotics through the IV while waiting for the transport ambulance. Jack remained unconscious but stable, though his temperature hovered dangerously high, and his blood pressure dipped in unpredictable rhythms. Dr. Monroe stood by his side, arms crossed, eyes tired. "He's lucky," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't have caught this until they were septic and delirious in a hotel room." "It was the dog," the nurse said again. "I've never seen anything like it." He kept pawing at the same spot, like he knew. Dr. Monroe nodded. "Some dogs smell blood sugar drops. Some smell cancer. I guess this one smelled something rotting." She paused, then looked at the nurse. "And something tells me it wasn't just physical. They prepared to move Jack onto a gurney for transfer." As the wheels locked into place and the team coordinated with EMTs, Gunner stood abruptly, tail-stiff, ears alert. He didn't bark, but he walked straight to the gurney and placed his head softly against Jack's shoulder. It was a moment that passed without comment, but none of the staff missed it. Something unspoken passed between them. An invisible line of trust forged in war carried through to peace now playing out under fluorescent lights and vinyl floors. The EMT team loaded Jack into the ambulance with efficiency. Gunnar followed to the doorway but was held back. "Sorry, Bud," one of them said. "You can't ride with us." Gunnar didn't resist, but his eyes locked on Jack until the door shut behind them. The last thing Jack would remember before waking again was the soft thud of those paws against the floor, the only sound his dulled ears could still somehow hear. The ambulance doors slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss, and Jack's body jolted slightly as the vehicle pulled out from the airport terminal toward the University Medical Center. Monitors beeped rhythmically inside the cabin, while the EMT beside him adjusted the IV line, checking vitals every few minutes. Jack remained unconscious, his skin pale and damp with a thin sheen of sweat forming along his temples. Outside, the world continued in its usual haste, planes rising into the sky while cars honked their way through morning traffic. But for the woman walking briskly into Terminal B's medical annex, time seemed to freeze as her name was called over the intercom. "Dr. Elena Torres, please report to Gate B16 medical response." The name echoed through the corridor, but Elena had already turned her steps quick and calculated the familiarity of that kind of page, still fresh, despite 5 years out of active military duty. She hadn't planned to stay in Denver past the week. This was supposed to be a temporary locum position, filling in for a friend who needed a break, catching up on paperwork, avoiding memories she hadn't figured out how to process. But as soon as she entered the triage area and saw the TSA supervisors, the security footage looping silently on a small monitor, and the canine alert logs, her heart skipped in a way she couldn't explain. "What's going on?" she asked a nurse as she scrubbed in at the sink. "Veteran collapsed during secondary screening. Dog alerted before we did. Possible sepsis from an old wound. They just took him to UMC," Name Elena asked, instinctively drying her hands. "Jack Simmons," the nurse replied, flipping a page on her clipboard. The name landed like a breath punched from her lungs. Elena froze mid-step, her eyes, wide lips parting as if repeating it silently would make it less real. "Did you say Simmons?" The nurse glanced up. "Yeah." "Why?" But Elena didn't answer because her brain was already replaying that day in Afghanistan, dusty and loud, the sky dimmed by the black coil of smoke rising from a roadside blast, the cries of medics moving through chaos. She remembered the blood soaking through a torn vest, the shrapnel embedded in a soldier's left flank, the way his eyes fluttered open just long enough to say one word: Gunnar. She hadn't thought of him in years, that broken soldier they medevaced out of the Kandahar province. But the name Simmons brought it all back, along with the quiet terror of wondering what had ever happened to him after that evac. She moved toward the medical monitor, playing back surveillance footage from the checkpoint, where a dark German shepherd stood rigid next to a slumping man. Her breath caught as she watched the dog paw the man's side precisely where the infection had now taken root. "That's him," she murmured under her breath before turning sharply. "I need to get to University Medical, now." No one stopped her. Within 20 minutes, Elena was walking into the ER wing, flashing her ID and bypassing the double doors, with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of command. Nurses recognized her. Some nodded, some didn't make eye contact. In room 3, Jack lay unconscious under a soft white sheet, one arm strapped with tubing, the other resting limply at his side. His breathing was shallow but steadier now, aided by IV antibiotics fluids and antipyretics working to push back the fever. Elena stood at the door for a second longer than necessary, observing the lines of age and fatigue carved deeper into his face than she remembered. She stepped inside. "Vitals?" she asked, softly startling the resident on shift. Still febrile, but pressures holding. Antibiotics seemed to be stabilizing him. "We've scheduled a CT to check for abscess depth and possible surgical need." Elena nodded, moving to his side. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, her own thoughts racing. She glanced down at his hands, still calloused, still shaped, like someone who had held rifles more often than pens. Then she leaned forward, gently. moved aside the sheet and looked at the inflamed tissue. She pressed lightly near the edge, checking for fluctuance. "He's lucky," she whispered. If the dog hadn't caught it, he could have coded in his sleep. The nurse beside her tilted her head. "You seem like you know him." Elena didn't answer directly. She pulled out her phone, opened a secure photo folder, and swiped until she found it an old combat med team picture taken on a scorching June morning in Helmand. She turned the screen toward the nurse. "That's me," she said, pointing at herself, then tapped the man kneeling in the front with a cast on one leg and his other arm slung. "And that's Simmons. I treated him 6 years ago in Afghanistan. Shrapnel wound. Medivaked out. I haven't seen him since." The nurse's eyes widened. "Wow. Small world." Elena didn't smile. She just stared at Jack, remembering how he had slipped out of consciousness in the dust while she packed his wound with gauze, how she had prayed he'd live long enough to get to the airfield. "He used to be sharper than this," she said softly. "Always 2 steps ahead of the unit's humor, stubborn as hell." She shook her head. "Hard to see him like this." Suddenly, Jack stirred. It was subtle at first, a twitch in his fingers, a shift in his shoulders, but then his eyelids fluttered and his breathing grew more deliberate. Elena leaned over, brushing a hand lightly on his arm. "Hey," she said, voice low, the tone carefully balanced between clinical and personal. "Jack, it's Elena, Dr. Torres, from Kandahar." Jack groaned softly, blinking through the haze. His lips moved barely audible. "Gunner?" "He's safe," she said quickly. "They wouldn't let him on the ambulance, but he's being held at the airport. I'll get him here, I promise." Jack blinked again, this time locking onto her face with bleary recognition. "Torres." The name came out like gravel, but she nodded. "Yeah, you're still alive, soldier. I wasn't sure we'd meet again, especially not in a place with vending machines and TSA scanners." Jack closed his eyes briefly, a half laugh escaping from his chapped lips. "Of all people." Elena sat down at the edge of the bed, taking a moment to steady herself. "They said you might need surgery," she added, shifting to the clinical facts. "The infection is sitting deep right at the edge of the old scar. I've seen worse, but this could get ugly if it travels." Jack gave a faint shrug. "Guess I can't outrun Kandahar forever." Elena didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed locked on his. "Maybe you're not supposed to," she said. The lights in Jack's hospital room dimmed to late afternoon amber, casting long shadows across the tiled floor and highlighting the worn seams of his IV tubing as it swayed slightly with every shallow breath. Dr. Elena Torres sat near the window, laptop open, but untouched, her gaze resting on the still figure of the man she hadn't seen in 6 years. The room was quiet now, the machines beeping softly, and the sharp edge of triage urgency had given way to something slower, something heavier. Jack had fallen back into light sleep, the antibiotics finally cutting into the infection's grip, and for the first time since his collapse, his face had relaxed just enough to remind her of the man from Kandahar, sarcastic, guarded, and fiercely loyal. Elena's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she finally began typing, an old habit from her field med days, where notes were never just for documentation but for remembering who these soldiers were before trauma made them unrecognizable. She titled the file Canine Memory Gunner, not because the dog could read it, but because his story in her mind deserved its own narrative. She began typing slowly, subject, Gunner male, German Shepherd, formerly MWD serial, K9021, assigned to 203rd Infantry Medical Response Unit, Afghanistan, 2017-2019. Handler Sergeant Jack Simmons. She paused, recalling her first interaction with the dog. It was 2 weeks after Gunner's initial deployment. He was barely past the 2-year mark, younger than the average active duty K9, and already marked for reassignment. The reason was simple and bureaucratic: delayed alert responses. Not a failure to detect, just a hesitation 1 second too long before barking one glance too many before sitting beside a suspected case. In a war zone, that hesitation could kill. Most handlers wouldn't risk it. They'd cycle the dog out, call it a behavioral flaw, and move on. But Jack hadn't been most handlers. She remembered the argument outside the field tent vividly, Jack standing stiff-backed in front of his CO voice low but firm. "He's not confused," he had said. "He's just reading the situation longer than you want him to. He doesn't react fast because he's double-checking. That's not a defect, that's intelligence." The CO hadn't been convinced, but Jack had insisted on keeping Gunner under his supervision for an unofficial 30-day reevaluation. No one expected it to amount to anything. But then came the mission in Sector Green, one of those long, blistering patrols in a valley lined with irrigation ditches, heat waves rising off the dirt like ghosts. Elena had been with the medical convoy half a mile back from Jack's unit when the call came in, possible casualty unknown, cause Sergeant Simmons reporting suspicious behavior from K9. When they arrived on scene, Gunner was already locked onto a spot just beyond the outer wall of a mud brick storage hut. Jack had tried to call the all clear, assuming a false alert, but something in the dog's stillness unnerved him. Elena remembered Jack's words through the comms. "He's not barking, but he's not backing off either. He smells something I can't see." That moment changed everything, because when Elena and 2 medics entered the hut minutes later, they found a young Afghan farmer slumped in the corner. Not a threat, not a bomber, just a civilian with a festering leg wound seeping through his robe. The smell was faint to human noses, masked by dust and livestock, but Gunner had picked it up from yards away. It wasn't the usual scent signature of explosives or narcotics. It was infection, subtle decaying blood, a sourness that triggered something in the dog's instincts. Elena knelt beside the man, opened her trauma kit and stabilized his vitals, whispering thanks to a dog she'd nearly forgotten by name. That incident was reported up the chain, and for the first time in their unit, a K9 team received a special designation, Tactical Medical Scent Recognition. Jack had laughed when the plaque came in. "Sounds like an allergy test," he said, but Elena had seen the pride in his face. Back in the hospital room, Jack stirred again, this time shifting his leg slightly beneath the blanket. Elena looked up from the laptop. "You're awake," she said, closing the lid gently. Jack groaned. "Sort of." His voice was hoarse. "What time is it after 5? You've been out for a few hours." "Fever broke an hour ago. CT scan shows localized abscess. You'll need a minor procedure, but no organ involvement." "We caught it early." Jack nodded faintly. "Figures. He caught it first." Gunner Elena smiled. "Yeah, he always does." Jack opened his eyes, fully adjusting to the dim light. "You remember when they tried to cut him from the unit?" Elena nodded. "I was there." Jack let out a dry chuckle. "He wasn't defective, just patient. You were the only one who saw it." She replied. "The rest of us thought he was slow. That's because he listens better than most humans. You tell him something once, and he runs it over 3 times before acting. Sometimes I wish people worked that way." They sat in silence for a moment, both watching the drip of the IV fluid into Jack's arm. Elena finally reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a laminated card, the one they issued after Gunner's designation became official. She handed it to Jack. "I kept this. Thought you might want it back." Jack turned it over slowly. The words were simple. K9021, Special Tactical Medical Scent Classification. Active 2018. His name and Gunner's were etched beneath it. Jack's fingers brushed the surface like he was holding a relic. "They gave us that the same day I got hit, didn't they?" 2 days before, Elena corrected. "We had the ceremony in the mess tent. You were late." Jack smiled faintly. "I was always late, but you were the only one who stayed after to sweep up the confetti." Jack exhaled slowly, his thumb still tracing the words on the card. "I almost forgot about all this," he murmured. "Feels like another life." Elena studied his face, softened now by memory. "It wasn't another life. It's just the part we never really left." Jack shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed as the nurse adjusted the IV flow, his muscles aching in a familiar slow-burning way that reminded him of deployment nights, quiet, tense, and filled with that heavy stillness before something cracked open. Elena stood nearby, reviewing his scan results on a tablet, her eyes narrowed and jaw tight. "You're lucky," she muttered without looking up. "If that abscess had gone another 24 hours, we might be having a very different conversation." Jack scoffed lightly, but it came out brittle. "Define lucky." Elena turned the screen toward him. "This," she said, pointing at the colored blotch on the scan, "isn't just soft tissue infection. There's something embedded here deep in the fascia. That dark line, it's metal." Jack frowned. "I thought they got everything out after the blast." "Apparently not," Elena said. "Or this worked its way deeper over time. It's small, maybe a fragment, but it's reacting with the tissue. Caused localized necrosis. The immune response couldn't isolate it fast enough." Jack looked away, jaw tightening. "So it's been inside me this whole time, sitting there, waiting." Elena added, "It's not just any metal either. The lab's flagging trace elements cadmium nickel lead. That's not standard shrapnel, it's industrial." Jack's eyes darkened. "That blast wasn't a regular IED," he said quietly. "We always suspected, but intel never confirmed it." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jack sat up straighter, wincing slightly. "We were hit outside the safe zone, 3 soldiers down. The heat signature didn't match other devices in the area. It had a burn pattern that suggested modified casing, something rigged, maybe even smuggled in from outside the region." Elena stared at him for a long second. "You're saying you think the source was external?" "Like American-sourced," Jack hesitated. "Black market, could have come from anywhere. But that kind of metal-engineered rare alloy, you don't find that in rural Afghanistan." Across the city, back at the airport terminal, Gunner sat in a corner of the holding area near baggage claim leashed but not crated per TSA exception. His handler from the security team, a retired Coast Guard officer named Jenkins, watched him closely. The dog had been calm for hours, lying motionless except for the occasional ear flick, but something had changed in the last 15 minutes. Jenkins noticed the way Gunner's nose twitched, nostrils flaring softly, body low and still, like he was processing a scent too subtle for human detection. The dog stood slowly tail stiff, then walked deliberately toward the terminal entrance, halting just shy of the glass doors as a group of passengers walked past on the other side. Jenkins followed, puzzled, until Gunner froze, eyes locked on a man in a gray hoodie dragging a battered aluminum suitcase. The dog growled low, not a bark, not aggressive, just deep and pointed. Jenkins stepped forward. "Easy, buddy. What is it?" But Gunner didn't move. His stare was unbroken. The man in the hoodie stopped at the check-in counter, pulled out an ID, and began chatting casually with the attendant. Jenkins radioed his supervisor. "We may have an alert from the Simmons K9, he said. Behavioral stance indicates focus. Could be scent trigger." The supervisor responded immediately. "Hold visual, don't engage." Jenkins adjusted his position, watching as Gunner took a half step forward, his body now in full alert mode. A second TSA officer joined him, eyes narrowing as he recognized the stance from training. "That's a medical alert posture," he whispered, "same as earlier today." The man in the hoodie glanced in their direction briefly, then turned back to his phone. Unbothered. Almost too calm. At the hospital, Elena received the lab report confirming the fragment's composition. She handed the file to a federal liaison who had arrived an hour earlier, tipped off by airport security. "This metal's trace signature matches components from a private military contractor's armor disposal inventory," the agent said, reading aloud. "Same type found in 3 flagged incidents over the past 2 years, including 1 in Kandahar." Elena's mouth went dry. "So it's the same material that wounded Jack, likely from the same source," the agent nodded. "But here's the thing. It's not just leftover debris. Someone's using contaminated alloy in civilian environments. This could be deliberate." Her phone buzzed. It was the airport supervisor. "Dr. Torres," the voice came fast and clipped, "your patient's K9 just alerted on a civilian at the terminal. Dog behavior matches earlier incident. We're holding position. Do you want us to detain Elena's pulse jumped?" "Don't touch him yet," she said. "What's the civilian carrying metal suitcase? Looks old, worn down, but he won't let it out of sight. And the dog, he's locked on it." Elena turned to the federal agent. "You need to send someone there, now. The dog's responding to something chemically similar. This may be connected to the infection. Or worse. Meanwhile, in the terminal, the man in the hoodie had noticed the growing attention. He adjusted his grip on the suitcase, casually repositioning himself near the escalator. Jenkins moved subtly to block one path while another agent began circling the perimeter. Gunner hadn't barked yet, but his body language had changed. He was tense, head low as if preparing for an invisible threat, and then suddenly he sat. Not a common sit, a deliberate one, the signal for danger that couldn't be seen, only sensed. Jenkins whispered into his radio, confirmed alert. Subject stationary. K9 indicates a chemical or medical trigger consistent with prior reaction. Upstairs, surveillance teams were already rolling back the footage, matching the man's entry time with passenger manifests. His name wasn't on the domestic flight list. No checked bags, no ID scanned. Ghost. The suitcase, when magnified through thermal cam, showed a faint heat signature at the bottom seam. Elena, still in scrubs and now pacing the ER hallway, received a second call. "We need confirmation on your patient's injury. Was the metal ever scanned for pathogen traces?" "Not yet," she said. "Why?" The voice on the other end was grim, because if it's infected alloy, if someone's moving that intentionally, we may be dealing with exposure. The moment the thermal camera registered the unusual heat signature from the bottom seam of the suitcase, a silent alarm was triggered inside the airport's threat assessment control room. A small team of analysts, all ex-military or Homeland Security trained, gathered around the monitor with practiced urgency. One of them, a wiry analyst named Marquez, zoomed in, marking the exact coordinates on the baggage and cross-referencing the material response data with their substance detection index. "We've got anomalies in temperature consistency," he said, quickly tapping the screen. "It's not electronics or batteries, it's chemical. Something reacting from the inside, low burn pattern. Likely stable for now, but not by design." Meanwhile, back in the terminal, TSA officers had quietly escalated their posture around the man in the hoodie. He didn't seem nervous, didn't fidget or check over his shoulder. That, in fact, made them more concerned. It was the calm of someone who had already accepted the outcome. Gunner remained perfectly still, body rigid beside Jenkins, eyes locked on the suitcase. A bomb squad unit was already suiting up in the garage level, preparing to intercept. Within minutes, the decision was made: extract the suspect, isolate the item, and clear the immediate vicinity under a Tier 2 protocol. As officers moved in, they flanked from three sides, announcing the order with quiet authority. "Sir, step away from your bag, hands visible." The man didn't flinch. He merely set his phone down on the counter and turned slowly, palms open. "I've got nothing to hide," he said flatly. The bag, however, told another story. Inside a secure containment zone within the airport's forensic lab, a robotic arm lifted the suitcase lid. Layers of seemingly innocuous materials, clothes, personal items, toiletry kits had been used to conceal a lower compartment, crudely welded and lined with lead foil. When that layer was breached, the instruments lit up. Reading synthetic volatile compounds said, 1 tech base markers for chlorinated hydrocarbons, phosphorus variants. This is not commercial. The lead investigator, a gray-haired explosives expert with 25 years of service, leaned closer. "Are we looking at organophosphates?" "Partially," the tech replied. "But it's laced with bacterial spore agents. Weaponized strain. This isn't just a bomb, it's a biochem hybrid." A silence settled across the lab. A senior DHS agent entered seconds later, reviewing the early findings. "Pull up the composition matrix," he ordered. The results came on-screen: chemical strands, reactive breakdown charts, and most importantly, a side note from the Department of Defense's internal archive. The match was clear. "It's variant X," the agent said grimly. "Same material used in the 2019 Kandahar breach." One of the techs looked up. "That's classified ordnance. Supposed to be off-grid." "It wasn't," the agent replied. "And now we've got a direct trace." In his hospital bed across town, Jack sat upright, forehead damp, as Elena read the initial forensic report aloud. He stared blankly for a second, trying to process. "You're telling me the crap inside me, the thing that almost killed me, was a diluted version of this bomb?" "Not diluted," Elena said carefully. "Residual. but it matches the chemical profile. Down to the synthetic trace markers. Jack leaned back slowly, exhaling. That's not random, that's targeted. Or recycled, Elena added. Someone's pulling material from old blast zones, weaponizing it for civilian transport. That man, your dog's alert, was carrying a second-generation variant. If that suitcase had opened under pressure, God knows what could have spread. Jack's eyes darkened. Variant X didn't just take down our convoy, he said slowly. It burned through skin, ate through Kevlar-triggered cardiac arrhythmia in the second casualty, and they still classified it as low yield. Elena's hands clenched the report tighter. It was supposed to be destroyed. Back at the airport, the suspect sat cuffed to a bench in a holding cell, unmoved by the commotion outside. Agents took fingerprints, scanned IDs, searched aliases. He refused to speak, no threats, no manifesto, just a cold, deliberate silence. But the story was already unfolding through forensic backchannels. The suitcase's alloy lining matched recovered debris from the same device that wounded Jack. The agent who debriefed Elena wasn't subtle. We believe your patient and this suspect are linked. Not personally, tactically. We're looking at a material pipeline that's repurposing classified military compounds for unknown operations. This is bigger than one man. Elena glanced over at Jack, who had gone quiet again, eyes fixed on a spot beyond the hospital window. He doesn't think it's random, she said. Neither do I. In a secure terminal hangar, bomb techs continued disassembling the device's shell, careful to isolate temperature thresholds and air exposure triggers. One of the younger technicians paused, reading a side panel etched with barely visible serial numbers. This wasn't made for this case, he murmured. This container was repurposed from a medical supply vault. Old military shipping crate, converted to look like luggage. Another agent leaned in. So whoever packed this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't just smuggled, it was engineered. The older explosives expert nodded, and masked with civilian travel debris. It's brilliant in a horrifying way. No scent traces from narcotics, no traditional explosive signature. If that dog hadn't reacted to the infection profile, this would have gone undetected. Jenkins received the update over his earpiece, glancing down at Gunner, who was now lying beside his feet, calm again. You did good, he said softly, patting the dog's head. Gunner didn't respond, but his stillness spoke volumes. Back at the hospital, a second DHS agent stepped into Jack's room, a new file under his arm. Mr. Simmons, we need your cooperation. There's a link between the attack that injured you and what we just intercepted. You're not just a survivor, you're a data point. Your infection wasn't an accident. Jack's voice was low but clear. Then I want answers, and I want that dog in here while we find them. The DHS agent leaned in across the small conference table inside the secured wing of the airport medical annex, placing a thin file folder in front of Jack, Elena, and two Homeland Security officials. The folder's contents were stamped classified in bold red letters, and the agent's voice was quiet but firm as he said, "What we're dealing with here isn't random, and the suspect isn't just a courier, he's part of the network." Jack opened the folder, slowly flipping to a page that showed passport-style photos of the hoodie man, accompanied by service record printouts and contract employment logs. His eyes flicked across the typed rows listing deployment dates, unit associations, and discharge status. He looked up, jaw tightening. This guy was with Tech Solutions International, Jack said, lowly rechecking the logo on the file. TSI was one of those PMCs that recruited ex-special forces and embedded in Tier 1 units overseas. He got hired after Kandahar, Jack whispered. I remember the after-action reports TSI had a contract supporting our medevac teams. Elena's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the lines. He was embedded with you. Jack shook his head. No, his team was assigned to logistics, but he would have moved through forward operating bases near mine. The agent picked up. He was terminated under suspicious circumstances 6 months after your blast. Company records show he was detained for misconduct on base, argument, refusal to follow protocol, but the real issue was misappropriation of gear. He disappeared into heavy surveillance until about 2 weeks ago. We believe he resurfaced to target you." Jack looked back at the photo. The man in the hoodie, early 40s, cold eyes lean like someone who'd survived too many night shifts and too little sleep. He felt a flicker of recognition. The hoodie and that dead-eyed calm he remembered passing him in Kandahar, once walking over to the med tent just after one of Jack's missions. A face in the blur. But his mind had clicked it off as one more contractor. Now it clicked again with painful clarity. The agent continued, "Our intel suggests he lost more than a job, he lost his identity. He blamed a leak, said the unit had outed his mishandling, got him blacklisted. His files reference deep resentment at the U.S. government, and an odd fixation he named your unit as one of the reasons he wouldn't get rehired." Elena closed her eyes briefly. "He's here to settle a score," the agent nodded. "And he didn't realize you'd be here too until he logged your face in the terminal." Jack turned to the pages, finding a passenger manifest with the suspect's name next to the flight that landed here this morning. His heart began to pound. "I was sitting one gate over," Jack said. "I saw him check his bag, then sit down. The timing. This wasn't coincidence." Elena swallowed visibly. "He's stalking you." Jack shut the folder. He didn't know I'd be on antibiotics or in the hospital. He just wanted to replicate the attack. Same method infected alloy biochem. He's testing it. The agent leaned forward. "We retrieved a lab sample from the suitcase. Preliminary profile matches the compound from your abscess, albeit in lower yield, and the alloy fragment matches the TSI disposal inventory." Jack closed his eyes. "So, he's targeting us where it hurts literally." Elena reached out, placing a steadying hand on his thigh. "He wanted revenge." Jack nodded slowly, but he found me standing still. The agent tapped his pen. "He'll stand trial for attempted terror assault with bioweapon conspiracy. But this was aborted at launch." Jack bit his lip. "Does he know who I am?" "No evidence yet that you were his specific target," the agent replied. "But he's called your unit by name in encrypted messages." Jack's breathing slowed. "He's after them," he murmured. So, this was personal and anonymous. Elena squeezed his leg, but he didn't know Gunnar would catch it first. Jack looked down at his dog's card lying on the bed. "Gunnar's grace saved us." Elena's voice dropped low. "He followed him to the hospital. He's watching. Says so in his logs." Jack exhaled. "Give me one thing, I want to meet him." Elena's eyebrows lifted. "Are you sure?" Jack's gaze hardened. "He ambushed us with that shit. I want his face." The agent nodded slowly. "We can arrange video link. He's being held in federal custody." Elena hesitated. "He might incriminate others." Jack's eyes flared. "Then we find them." The agent stood. "We'll bring logs and preliminary interrogation to your room. He'll be ready in 6 hours." Jack glanced toward the closed door to the hallway where Gunnar rested. "Better prepare coverage," the agent nodded. As he left, Elena turned back to Jack. "You're sure you want this?" Jack swallowed hard. "Yeah, I need to see what hate looks like." Elena's lips parted, and she exhaled, slowly steeling herself. "Then let's meet him." The operation in the airport hangar unfolded with quiet precision. K-9 gunner alert and taut led the way down a roped-off corridor, as 2 federal agents and a bomb technician flanked him. Lights low and steps muted. The suspect, cuffed and seated in a reinforced surveillance room, watched on an adjacent screen as his own dog, Jack's dog, tracked the precise scent trail from luggage carousel to a single nondescript black rolling suitcase by gate 27. Gunner stopped at that bag nose inches from the handle tail, stiff but not wagging ears pressed forward. The bomb tech eyes narrow, eased forward with an X-ray scanner confirming an unfamiliar device nestled inside the lining and electronic wires coiled around a cylindrical metal module. Agents froze the bag's movement and signaled through comms. The suspect, still under watch, heard over the wire. "Your bag has been flagged. Don't try anything." The countdown on the device had not started, no ticking, no digital timer display suggesting remote activation. Gunner paced slowly in front of the suitcase, sitting as the bomb tech circled it, tapping the device's casing. Gunner blinked once, then let out a low, deliberate bark, an alert. "This is it." The technicians sprang into action. One clipped a remote signal jammer to the suitcase's side, while another distracted the device with metal shims to prevent any secondary triggers. Agents positioned themselves behind the blast shield as one technician carefully removed the outer panel. Inside the bomb, Tech recognized a detonator cradle connected to a wireless receiver likely controlled remotely. If the suspect encountered Jack at the terminal, he could have initiated the countdown from a hidden location. The discovery that the timer hadn't activated suggested a flaw in the build, or intentional sabotage for this test run. As the bomb tech removed the detonator, the device sighed with a pneumatic hiss, a controlled pressure release, and they defused the circuit. Gunner remained motionless until the lead technician held up the detonator module and signaled safe. The dog exhaled sharply, tail-lowering eyes softening. Men in hazmat gear moved in to confiscate the components, while agents secured the suspect before transporting him to a federal lockup. Back in the control room, DHS analysts stared at the feed in silence. The bomb tech repeated through comms device neutralized. No countdown occurred. Live components intact for testing. Agent Marquez scribbled notes, Test Batch 3, recovery success, no timer activation manual containment achieved. Gunner sat at the terminal entrance as crowd movement resumed once the gate reopened. Jenkins kneeled and removed the leash hugging the dog's muzzle. You did good, boy. Better than good. As they walked away, the suspect's video feed showed his clenched jaw and narrowed eyes he hadn't broken. But the blind test had failed. Back in Jack's hospital room, Elena received the live update via secured lines and whispered he had planned for this. Jack's grip on the sheet tightened. He underestimated him, he said. Elena's eyes shifted to the closed doorway behind which Gunner rested on a mat, silent, vigilant. The realization settled without that dog the bomb would have boarded the next flight. Gunner hadn't just detected the threat he'd led them to, its heart saved countless lives and kept the chain of events from reaching fruition. The days that followed moved with a measured quiet, as if the entire airport and hospital had taken a collective breath they weren't quite ready to release. Jack remained in the intensive observation wing for 72 hours, monitored hourly, while the infection site responded steadily to targeted antibiotics, and the surgical team finished removing the embedded metal fragment that had silently poisoned him for years. And though his body bore the marks of a long war scar tissue webbed across his hip, pale grooves from tourniquet drills in the field, and that ever-present rigidity in his shoulders, his vitals were steady, and more importantly, he was alive. The surgery had gone better than expected with Elena at the helm, and though she tried to hide her emotional investment behind protocol, Jack could see the slight change in her voice whenever she stepped into the room, softer, closer to the tone of someone not just treating a patient, but protecting a brother in arms. And then, on the third day, something changed. Jack was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed bandage, tucked neatly along his left side, his shirt half buttoned, when he heard it, a muffled abrupt sound near the door, almost like a bark through a thick blanket, and he turned instinctively toward the noise Browse knitting as he tilted his head, and there it was again, sharper this time. Unmistakable, the quick two-tone bark that Gunner always used when requesting attention or when alerting Jack to something small but urgent. Jack blinked, heart racing, and lifted his hand slowly to his left ear, the one that had been dead since Kandahar. And for the first time in nearly 6 years he heard something faint, filtered but real, and he said softly, almost afraid to speak, "Was that?" Elena, already standing at the doorway with her tablet, froze mid-step, watching the realization dawn across his face like sunrise over cold concrete. "Say something," he said, eyes wide, and Elena hesitated only a beat before saying, "Jack, can you hear me?" Her voice came through faint and distorted like underwater radio, but it was there, unmistakably her cadence, her warmth, her steadiness, and Jack let out a broken laugh, half in disbelief, half in joy, pressing a palm to his ear. "It's muffled," he said, "but I swear I heard you." Later, the ENT specialist confirmed it. The pressure from the embedded infection had created a rare occlusion behind the eardrum, and once it was relieved during surgery, sound had begun to pass through again. Not full capacity, not perfect fidelity, but a partial restoration. The damage from the blast was irreversible. Yes, but some pathways had been simply blocked, not destroyed. And now, after years of silence, Jack could hear again at least enough to register the bark that started it all. News traveled fast as it often did when a hero in uniform and a war dog crossed paths with near terror in a major U.S. airport. And by the end of the week, a quiet ceremony had been arranged at the terminal lounge, not for media, not for show, but for those who had been there, the TSA agents who held the line. The medics, who responded in minutes, the bomb techs who trusted a dog's posture over a scanner's silence, and, most importantly, Gunner, who stood proudly next to Jack Vest, freshly cleaned eyes sharp, and tail poised, not wagging, but alert, dignified. The Homeland Security Director stepped up to the make voice steady and presented a silver medallion engraved with the department's insignia, and the words, "For Valor Beyond Duty," slipping it onto Gunner's collar as the room broke into quiet applause. Jack stood beside him, one hand resting on the dog's back, the other clenching the edge of a manuscript he'd begun writing again, something he'd abandoned years ago. A personal account of war and survival trauma and loyalty, memory and silence. Now the title page bore a new line freshly typed in the early hours after his hearing returned, and it read simply, "The first sound I heard again was the bark of my friend." Jack leaned in as Gunner sat at his feet during the ceremony, whispering low so only the dog could hear. "I thought I was saving you that day they tried to cut you from the unit, but you've been saving me ever since." And Gunner, as if understanding, let out a soft huff and rested his head gently against Jack's knee. Later, Elena joined them, standing quietly with 2 coffees in hand, passing one to Jack as the sun spilled across the tarmac outside Gate 23, where everything had started, and as they stood there not as doctor and patient, not as veterans, but as people pulled through the same fire and brought out the other side. Jack smiled faintly and said, "Funny, how life circles back, how healing doesn't always come from medicine," and Elena nodded, raising her coffee. "Sometimes it comes with fur and 4 legs." If you felt something in this story, consider subscribing for more real, emotionally driven journeys like Jack and Gunner's. I'm curious what part of their story hit you the hardest, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it.